Okay, we should be live now. I have to apologize. This is not the original feed we were going to be going for those people who have actually gone to the other location. Hopefully, Siobhan has now commented in the new location link, which is here, and hopefully will remain here. Now that we've got you on, Spencer, I hope we can keep you. How are you doing?
Good, good, good. Thanks for having me.
Thanks. I actually warned you of this in the email that the downside of being the first in a series, and especially if we have a new setup, is that there's going to be some bumps. Boy, was I prescient on that.
That's all right. That's all right. Any new things when it comes to technology?
Yes.
I've had the same type of stuff, endeavors in the past.
So one issue we have is now, like I was all set up on the prior version that was the scheduled event. Now I won't have it to where I can throw it up on screen. I tried a couple times to invite what's basically a proxy user that I was using to have some PowerPoint slides on where we'd also have the questions and so forth. So I'm gonna kind of have to wing that part. It won't be as visually pleasing, but it'll be pretty much the same thing. So real quick, let's go ahead and pop over to the format, as it were. Oh boy, that too is now kind of lost. So I have to bring it back over again. Okay, there we go. Yeah. So real quick, why don't you go ahead and give us just a real brief background?
Quickly, family medicine and obesity physician, big interest on lipids. I should have taken my lipid boards 3 years ago. I don't know, it keeps putting them off. My wife's a Navy doctor. We move, blah, 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 blah. I've studied for them. I'll probably take them this spring unless something happens. But big onto lifestyle medicine, big onto, people think I'm against low carb, but I'm actually, I like low carb. That's where I've been.
Don't worry about that. We'll get into that. And there's plenty of time to get into that.
That's the background. Into lipids, lifestyle medicine, diet, exercise, family physician, obesity physician.
How long have you been practicing?
Graduated medical school 2011, residency for 3 years, 2011, 2014. So I was practicing since 2011, but 3 of those years of residency. Past 4 years have been on my own.
And just real quick, you actually just came back from an obesity conference, is that right?
Yep, Obesity Week, where Dr. Ludwig and all those guys presented their data.
That's just fantastic. It is a sign of the times that there are so many obesity conferences. There weren't before. So that's
try to figure it out. This one, you should come to it. I know you're more into the lipids thing, but of course, ketogenic diets and obesity is pretty big deal now. So it's the biggest obesity conference of the year, every year, called Obesity Week. The surgeons, the researchers, and the medical bariatric doctors, obesity doctors, all get together, dietitians, exercise physiologists, and just talk about what the heck we're going to do. So.
Yeah, well, believe me, I definitely think it's important. So I'm going to ask you the big 7, as I was mentioning before, in an email, and that we got through social media. I gave you in advance. But before I do want to give the audience a little extra context. You're a little special in the sense that even though you're not as prominently featured in the low carb community, you kind of, you might say that you probably straddle a little more between the worlds. You and I have had a lot of contact offline, and I've actually asked you if you would be willing to write a piece for cholesterolcode.com that might be a little more of a contrast, kind of more of a counter opinion. And in that sense, I think it's good because in a way, you'll get a chance to sort of talk about these opinions here. And in that regard, I really want to emphasize part of the reason I wanted to have this limited series of around like maybe 8 or 10 of these episodes is I really wanted to present people with a broad spectrum of different opinions. I think that's very important for us to move the conversation forward.
Yeah, absolutely.
So real quick, I'll move to the big 7 that I plan to ask everybody. And really the first 4 are kind of in the same category, if you will. Number 1, what is your current opinion on the optimal range for total cholesterol if you were to give a minimum and a maximum?
Yeah, so if we're just going to go black and white, just like minimum, maximum, it's going to be around like 100 to like 220. But it really depends on the individual. I don't know how, we can get into that a little bit later, but
It's
like,
not a courtroom. It's just you're ballparking. It's
yeah,
fine.
I'm gonna go 100 to about 220-ish.
All right. And if you were to say the same thing with LDL cholesterol, what would you give LDL cholesterol?
Yeah, so I could go very far down on the LDL. You're looking at some of these PCSK9 trials, but anywhere around 20s to 30s, all the way to, I'd say probably 130 to 160-ish.
130 to 160.
Over deciliters, yeah.
Yes, we're not doing the international unit conversion. We're just trusting in the milligrams per deciliter. What's your current opinion on HDL cholesterol? Minimum.
I'd say, yeah, I'm going to say probably around at least 50s, but likely more like 60s to 80s, 90s, I'd say.
So you would get concerned if like HDL cholesterol exceeded 90?
I do.
Okay.
Before it was like, oh great, you got a 90 something, you're 100, whatever. But, the more and more we get into this, the HDL thing, it's like, we just don't know enough about it. I'm starting to see more and more come out as like, yeah, maybe that's not so great having it higher. But again, the mechanisms, if you listen to,
no worries, we'll get into that. This is why it's kind of fun to read through.
Yeah.
And your opinion on triglycerides, minimum and maximum?
I would say I'm going to go with around 20 to, I hate even saying 100, because even at around 100, I'd be like, nah, that's kind of high. But I'm going to say 20 to 100.
Okay, great. So number 5, with regard to cholesterol-lowering medication, do you feel too little is being prescribed, or too much? Just in general.
I think too much is being prescribed to the wrong people, and I think too little is being prescribed for the right people. That's kind of a nuanced answer, but I see it prescribed to people. I'm like, well, that doesn't make any sense. Whereas other people, I'm like, yeah, they should probably have it. So that's my nuanced answer.
Number 6, if you had to guess a percentage, how much of modern heart disease is typically the result of diet?
Yeah, I'm going to say the majority. You're wanting a percentage. I don't know if I can actually give a specific 75, 80%, and that's not just from lipids, cholesterol. It's more of overall abdominal obesity and adiposopathy, whatever you want to say, insulin resistance plus lipids, whatever.
Yeah, great. And finally, as of course is what we kind of alluded to from a little bit earlier, do you feel those going on a low carb diet should take steps to lower their LDL cholesterol, the so-called bad cholesterol, if it has increased, even if other cardiovascular risk factors have improved?
Yeah, I think it depends on how much it's increased. If it's increased, 10 points, whereas everything else is pretty much gone, probably not a big deal. I was just with Dr. Tro at the Obesity Week, and we were going over cases and laughing about the nuances of like, well, what would you do here? So I'm going to say it depends on the extent of how much it's increased. Did it go into the FH range, like we can talk about, or if it's just a little bit, whereas everything else, all the other risk factors are gone, I probably wouldn't worry so much. But I do feel like if it increases exponentially, that they should take steps to lower it.
Okay, great. That's effectively the drop-off point, or should say the jump-off point. Go ahead and give us kind of your progression, you personally, in what you've learned about cholesterol and sort of where your opinion stands to date.
Yeah, I think this is really important. So I'm cut from a low carb jib, or whatever you want to say. In medical school, I started hanging out with guys like Dr. Finney, Mary Vernon at the time, Dr. Westman. I went to the bariatric conferences. Very smart obesity physicians who had a very strong low carb spin to them. But in that, though, there is this LDL skepticism. And so I had a lot of mentors who were, very skeptic of the LDL hypothesis. So while I'm learning in medical school that, everybody should be on a statin type of thing and you need your cholesterol lower, I'm also getting mentors who are very smart, who are kind of bringing up some of the skepticism and some of the issues with the whole LDL hypothesis. So because, you're in medical school and you're just trying to learn how to float, you kind of go towards what your mentors are telling you without necessarily diving into the research yourself, because there's just so much you have to learn from the basics. So initially, I was a very big LDL skeptic or cholesterol skeptic. In fact, Facebook memory just popped up yesterday. My brother tagged me in 2010 when I was in medical school. His cardiologist mentor was saying how, like, hey, well, babies have very low, serum cholesterol levels. And all these little things, and I'm like, well, that doesn't make. How can we compare adults to babies? We have all sorts of differences, and some of the, I was like, that doesn't make sense. And you need, as you go through puberty, you need hormones, blah 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 blah. These are things that I brought up from books that I've read in LDL skepticism and things like that. And it wasn't until later, after medical school, I started diving deep into the research, because I started getting skepticism over the LDL skepticism. I listened to Dr. Dayspring on a podcast. Luckily, he was just down the road, 30 minutes or so. I asked him if I could come hang out. We talked. He sent me a bunch of books, and I started going to the NLA conferences. And after a while, I went from being kind of an LDL skeptic to now I'm like, oh, okay, I understand it in the grand scheme of things. And then I also started having patients who were doing ketogenic diets and high saturated fat diets, and started seeing those similar to what you're showing. Now, obviously you have a group full of 1,000 of these people that I have in residency. I started getting people would come to me because I had the social media presence. I was getting a lot of people, even in residency. I'm not even a fully board certified doctor. I was getting people from all over the world coming to see me, despite being in training. And I see these kind of explosive LDL levels, or non-HDL or ApoB, LDL particle, whatever you want to say, levels. And so I was trying my best to figure out ways to lower it without necessarily changing them from a ketogenic diet. So things like the monounsaturated fats and fiber and stuff. So anyway, my whole view on it is with the retention model of ApoB containing particles being retained as in the endothelium as the first step in atherosclerosis. So that being an independent risk factor, meaning, if you go through the whole analogy, and I'm writing this out for your blog, by the way, the analogy of the cargo ships, the lipoproteins, and the cargo being the cholesterol and triglycerides. Well, I go further in the analogy, talking about the endothelium being the walls of the harbor, the harbor wall. So if you have really healthy endothelium, you have a bunch of bumpers, big, huge rubber bumpers that, you don't necessarily crash and get stuck. Maybe if you can have more boats in the harbor without having as much of a risk, but you're still at risk of these things crashing if you have more boats. So I do think there's, both endothelial function, insulin resistance, and other risk factors, of course, and the LDL particles or ApoB containing particles. So I do think they're both. And so I do think lower is better ideally, but when given a scenario where, like you said, I have patients that reduce all their risk factors other than LDL or ApoB when they go on a ketogenic type of diet. They reduce their abdominal obesity, inflammation's gone. I think you can take it in a case-by-case scenario. Those patients, I'd say they're at a much higher or a much better risk profile. So I see it from both angles here, but I'm in the camp where LDL particles are independent risk factor.
Yeah, well, actually, something you said that I didn't realize before is you came from a more LDL skeptic standpoint in school. Like, I almost never hear that story. I usually hear it the other way around, that certain doctors, particularly low carb doctors, they've gone to school, they learned LDL is, equivalent to mortality. The higher it is, the more you're going to have the problems. What you're saying is early on in your mentoring, or I should say in being mentored, you got more of the skepticism initially, and then you were sort of pulled back in the other direction, especially with in having contact with luminaries like Dayspring, for example, right?
Yeah, and I guess it's more so I started looking at some of the skepticism type of questions. So like, well, cholesterol is used for hormones and bile acids and stuff. But then when I started looking into the science and started asking Dr. Dayspring and started looking at certain papers, it doesn't necessarily matter how much is in your serum, because each cell of your body makes cholesterol. So it's kind of like, oh, I guess we didn't actually need that much in our serum. So that kind of goes against that. Then some of the studies. So one of the things some of the things that came out right after residency. So the ENHANCE trial with Zetia showing, and simvastatin showing no differences, and there's statistical significant differences in CIMT. Do you remember? I don't know if you know that. Anyway, that was the first like big Zetia trial, and it was like, oh my gosh, it didn't show anything really. So, right. So some of that stuff, there was a Dr. Sinatra and Dr. Bowden book about the whole skepticism of LDL. I don't know if you've ever read it, but great stuff. They pick out a lot of things that seem like, well, that doesn't really seem to make sense. Well, after that came out, then of course the Improve It trial showed a positive result from adding the ezetimibe to a statin. And so then it was like, okay, maybe that preliminary trial, it didn't have a good hard outcome, as it was using CIMT. And then there's more things. The Genomic Wide Association studies, Mendelian randomization, then the PCSK9 things. I was kind of like, oh, because I was like, I'm a big lifestyle medicine guy. I hate having to give everybody medicine. So like I didn't want it to be reality that like we just have to give statins to everybody. And my passion for lipidology and actually just atherosclerosis, it doesn't have to be lipidology, but atherosclerosis in general, heart disease, began to grow, because it's like, well, I don't think we should have to give statins. So I kind of wanted to be skeptical. And it wasn't until all these other factors came out to where I was like, you know what, this seems to be the independent risk factor there, but I still think we should be helping people improve their lifestyle. And I don't think everybody should be on, ideally, most people wouldn't need a statin unless they have genetic increases. That's pretty much my stance. But people don't want to improve their lifestyle, other lifestyle factors, so you give them a statin, whatever. That's kind of.
No, I think you bring up some very interesting points. Certainly, when I was first jumping into this myself, that was a lot of what I was kind of picking up, was that there's more than enough evidence that if you have high LDL cholesterol, you've just got greater risk of death, period. I mean, there seemed to be a sort of summation, sort of a summarizing of it that was kind of brought to my attention a lot. The thing that I think was kind of the first moment for me was in reading up on things that LDL particles could do in a positive sense. Do you feel that there are things that are positive about LDL particles, or for that matter, any positive aspects, setting aside cardiovascular disease, to having higher LDL cholesterol or LDL particle count?
Yeah, it's hard. So, you start looking at some of these epidemiological studies, and I think someone in the questions asked, like, hey, how come we see sometimes these inverse relationships? So a lot of times we see these older women, we call them on the tea and toast diet. They're kind of meek, they're underweight, they're not eating much, and their cholesterol is nice and low. So you're like, wow, this is great. Except those are the ones that die early. So they have low cholesterol and they die earlier. And you're kind of like, well, they should have lived longer. They have low cholesterol. But there's so many other things going on, and with like a reverse causation type of thing. I'm looking at genetic studies and people with genetically low cholesterol or LDL particles. I don't know of any detrimental effects from that. I think it probably needs to be studied a little bit more. And when I started,
the studies you're speaking of, they they account for all of the S&Ps associated with LDL modifying?
Well, these are things that I think need to be teased out. Like when you start looking at some of these people with, like, say, PCSK9 deficiencies or decreases, I don't know enough of the literature to have they actually looked and say, what else is there anything actually negative? I know from an atherosclerosis standpoint that they're at lower risk. Like, that's what's shown. Are there other things going on? Like, hey, we start looking into cognitive health and mental health and things like that. Is that an issue? We talk about it shouldn't correlate as much in the brain because of the blood-brain barrier and all these things, but is there something, they don't know until post-mortem and they, check cholesterol level?
Actually, it's funny, there's actually some new stuff on that's been brought to my attention. Apparently there is some potential transcytosis with the blood-brain barrier that's brand new.
So that would be extremely interesting for me. I look at it from it's almost myopic, whatever you want to say, when I look at atherosclerosis, because it's so interesting to me. But are there positive things? I mean, I know you're looking into it with immunology and other things like that. Are there positive things that can come out of having a slightly higher LDL?
In other words, is there a trade-off? Is there, if there's any positive aspects to having LDL particles, even high LDL particles? To me, it's why I kind of press a lot on all-cause mortality. If you're looking at the final balance sheet, we would assume people who have these like nonsense mutations with PCSK9, they would be outliving us all. They would be, if you had hypobetalipoproteinemia, I think is what it's called, or abetalipoproteinemia.
That's trouble.
You should be like, great, I have no LDL floating around. I can now take the whole component of cardiovascular disease out of the equation, and therefore against the balance, if there's no benefit on any other aspect, then I should have lower overall mortality, right?
Yeah, and so, from a statistics standpoint, I would like to know more about that too. It's not something that I've looked into. I've looked at it strictly from an atherosclerosis lens. I don't know enough about other outcomes. As far as I've been told and gone to some of these conferences, these people live great lives. I mean, but do we know? I don't know if it's been studied enough. So I don't want to, from a lens of atherosclerosis, sure, we can look at these things, but from a lens of quality of life, we've talked about that before. Like, what if, they talk about, if you want to talk about like testosterone and things like that, doctors are not giving out testosterone, even if people look like they're in that hypogonadal range. But, quality of life is extremely important.
Absolutely.
And if you're not feeling great, then who cares how long you live? So I do think it's something that I definitely would love to learn more about and be like, all right, let's, we shouldn't only look at it from an atherosclerosis lens. I like looking at it like that because it's just interesting to me. But I do know that, like, especially if you're looking at putting somebody on a drug, the risk benefit and all those different things are very important. So.
No, I definitely agree. Let's go ahead and take some of these questions. I'm sorry I won't be able to flash the graphics on the screen. But as I mentioned to the audience a little bit earlier, I've had a chance to supply these to you, so there shouldn't be anything that's too much of a curveball. The first one we've got is, what is, quote, best practice in evaluating desirability of statin therapy and weighing likely benefit versus potential adverse side effects such as myalgia, myopathy, and increased risk of diabetes, which I think kind of dovetails nicely on what we were just talking about, is it not just in lowering LDL, but if there are some adverse effects to statins, how do you weigh that in determining if the patient goes on statin therapy?
Yeah, this is where I definitely want to look at their risk profile and have that shared decision making. I think I see some of these discussions are like, I can't believe you're a statin pushing shill. Not me personally, but I see other diets. It's like, no, there really needs to be. You need to educate the patient in front of you. You need to look at them we're not putting statins in the water. I know some people would like to do that, but I think looking at the patient in front of you, what is the risk? Do they have zero other risk factors, very healthy, exercising, and they're just LDL cholesterol is a little bit elevated? Are you really going to help them out by benefit? Are they going to benefit from getting a statin? So versus like someone who's very high risk and it's like a no-brainer. This is where that precision medicine and really coming in and honing in on the person's risk factors. So I will say that the side effects from statins, I don't see them that often. Where I do see them are a lot of times the higher dosed, Dr. Dayspring calls them gorilla statins, atorvastatin and rosuvastatin. But I don't see the side effects that often. Most people don't even notice, but it is something, we don't want to give them to everybody. We want to hone in on the right person to give them to. So, and that doctors should be doing that. They should be.
And for what it's worth, I really want to insert this because I do realize, and I get kind of embarrassed on behalf of a lot of people. I really want to emphasize that I want everybody to work with their doctor. If your doctor is not aligned with your goals, take the time and the effort to find a new doctor. But I'm not a fan of not being completely upfront with your doctor, even if your doctor may have different opinions. And I genuinely believe that the vast majority of doctors mean to do right by their patients and are doing their best to treat them in a way that they feel is going to help them. I do sometimes get frustrated because, and again, this is kind of a little bit what Peter Attia was mentioning before. You have a whole community of people who have been given advice that wasn't very helpful advice. And now all of a sudden they have this huge tunnel to health. And it kind of leads to a perspective of, I really just can't trust the entire profession. And it gets almost categorical in a way. And in that sense, I mean, this is part of why I wanted to kind of do this series is I really want to emphasize it's important to me for us to have dialogue constantly, even the most fervently opposite camps. But the one thing I don't want us to do is to close doors or to shut out other opinions. And in that respect, I really do want people to appreciate and try to find, in fact, for that matter, a lot of the low carb doctors these days, there are many who have many stories, Ted Naiman, Unwin, who will say that they had, a particular patient who came in, changed their lives. Some of them, it was like the 8th patient who was on a particular diet and helped them out, right? And I'm not even saying this just goes for low carb. This could also be for vegan and so forth. But regardless, I do think that there is a problem in that there's not as much recognition of diet. But even if your doctor doesn't recognize how much diet could be important, and you're pretty confident that it is, and certainly you and I on this video certainly think it is, I don't think that it's ultimately helpful to just, ghost them entirely. I think it's worth having the conversation with them. And I think it's worth appreciating that they do, even if they have strong opinions on what they think works and doesn't work, they do mean right by you. They do mean to help you.
We had this discussion on Twitter just the other day, but the system's broken. We don't learn enough about this stuff in medical school. We don't learn enough about it in residency. And the people that necessarily that go into medicine aren't necessarily into it anyway. So then they end up as a primary care doctor. I don't know any other primary care doctors that are as obsessed with lipids and diet as I am. I'm just not. I don't know anybody else. I really don't. I see some guys on Twitter and things like that. But my brother, we love it.
But I will say it is a little bit of a shame because I agree with you. I've talked to, I don't know, like maybe 70 or 80 GPs since I started this, which is crazy. But when you think about it, if around a third of the medicine you're prescribing is cholesterol lowering, I do think there should be a little more emphasis on that area, on lipids.
This should be, yeah, and I guess that's what that's what brought me to the skepticism, because I'm like, whoa. I didn't think my parents weren't on medicines early on in life, so I was kind of like, when I got to medical school and started seeing patients, I'm like, wait a second, why is everybody on all these medicines? It blew my mind. And then when you get into it, most doctors, they don't know, and the guidelines are actually pretty good. They go into this whole thing of when and when not and discussing risk. But I've noticed most doctors just don't have enough time. They're done with residency and training, and they're probably getting burned out. They don't even read the things, and then they don't even care. They have 10 minutes with a patient. They're like, screw it. So I noticed, yeah, when some of your, your followers or some of the people in your group go to the doctor, and the doctor doesn't have enough time to even explain, and they probably don't even know enough to even have a discussion. It's unfortunate. It really is unfortunate. But it would be like me talking about leukemia or something that I don't really know much about, or something like not enough about to have a. But
it's a good sign when, as a doctor, you can even say that. Like
right.
that's relevant, and that's where, like, it is good when you can say, oh well, I do know somebody, I do know a doctor who's really into this, who I could tell you about. Let's go do another question. What is the current verdict? This is from Mike Garcia. What is the current verdict on HDL triglyceride ratios? How does a type 2 diabetic with a 1:7 ratio respectively correct this on a keto carnivore diet?
Yeah, I'm not huge on the ratios. I know a lot of people like the ratio thing. I'm more of the absolute number. So
I am too, actually.
So I'm not big on the ratios. I mean, ideally, and also the HDL and trig ratio, it's probably just a better surrogate marker for not only insulin resistance, but LDL particles and ApoB containing particles, or ApoB. So with like a 1.7, that would indicate to me that you still have a lot of insulin resistance and maybe uncontrolled type 2 diabetes. But a carnivore or ketogenic diet, that would resolve that. I mean, I don't see it very often unless there's a genetic component to where their triglycerides don't just drop and their HDL normalizes. So weight loss with the ketogenic carnivore diet, not to mention improving the control of the type 2 diabetes just with keto alone, not even with weight loss, should improve that. So regardless, that should get better.
I should mention, by the way, a lot of times when we get these kinds of questions at Cholesterol Code, it usually helps to get a little more context. For example, a lot of people will get their lipids done like 3 weeks into a diet, and I don't care if it's a low carb diet or any diet. Like if you're in the process of, especially if you're like actively losing weight, if you are still in the keto flu, things like that, that's also pretty relevant as well. Yeah. The next question we've got from Richard Arneson is, please include ApoE4 ramifications in these discussions. Thanks. What's your opinion on ApoE4?
Yeah, Dave, have you asked your LMHRs about ApoE status? Because here's what I'll just say quickly what I found with SQ, but I was so interested because I'm like, what is going on with these patients with keto? And they're just explosive levels. I'm like,
can we give a little context just for those people who don't know what you mean by LMHR? We definitely do. Okay. You're using the shorthand for, let's take it a step back. There are a number of people who, when they go on a ketogenic diet, see their LDL cholesterol go very high. Mm-hmm. And we just kind of call that loosely, as a broader category, hyper-responders. Yep. There's a subcategory in that category that I dubbed lean mass hyper-responders last summer. And that actually turned out to be a fairly, almost shockingly common phenotype. And this is what that looks like. They tend to have LDL of 200 or higher. Bearing in mind, when I say LDL of 200 or higher, if you're not familiar with this is considered familial hypercholesterolemia or greater. In fact, the current guidelines that just got released say that you should be on a highest tolerable dose statin if you were at 190 or higher. HDL of 80 or higher, and triglycerides of 70 or lower. And the reason this became very relevant to me is, without going too deep into depth on this, for those who already know me, know a little familiarity with this, is that I present a sort of energy model to explain why that might be. And I want to emphasize, before going any further, while my energy model might explain why lean mass hyperresponders may have the numbers they do, I understand and respect that that could be a separate question from risk itself. It could be that that's an explanation as to the why. It doesn't necessarily explain as to whether it's a negative outcome. That's why I put a lot of emphasis and effort towards, in particular, seeking out data in large data sets of comparing LDL to high HDL and low triglycerides. And as you know, that I have that as like a challenge that I have on social media and so forth. So we're not going to go into that so much. That's more just to get a little bit of background before you mention, yes, you've since become a part of the Facebook group, and you've even asked some questions in there. But sure enough, yes, you were telling me you were stunned by how many people have extraordinarily high levels of LDL cholesterol
when they were normal before. That's what's so, because with FH, familial hypercholesterolemia, it's through childhood and beyond. This is normally seen, because this is what I saw in the clinic a year or so ago. Normal. This is 2011, 2012. All of a sudden, just explosive levels, and every one of them, ketogenic diet, bulletproof type of coffee, and so I'm like, oh, is this ApoE isoform? And so that was the question. There's 3 different ApoEs.
And I have an answer for you on that.
Okay.
So yeah, you were about to say the 3 different types. There's technically ApoE2, ApoE3, and ApoE4.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody has a copy of everybody has a copy of both. And oftentimes they're shorthanded. So I, for example, am an ApoE3/4. That means I have an ApoE3 allele and an ApoE4 allele. And I myself, when I first started this research, I had the understanding, this is what really correlates strongly with being a hyper responder, not even lean mass hyper responder, just hyper responder in general. And in my personal opinion, more than ever before, no, it has a slight proportional influence. The single greatest influence is how lean and how fit you are. How lean, how fit, and how low carb you are. Those 3 in particular, I feel like I could take right now, Spencer, I feel like I could take a group of 100 people who are already lean and athletic and put half of them on a low carb diet, and I'd be willing to bet I'd get a whole bunch of lean mass hyper responders.
I think you're right. So that's what I found. There was no correlation with ApoE status. And for those who don't know, the apolipoprotein E is one of these, proteins on the whole lipoprotein that can actually go into the LDL receptor. Once you have, most LDL particles don't actually have ApoE. It's these remnant particles, but if you have a E2 versus E3 versus E4, E3 is normal. That's what I am. That's what most of the patients are, despite having these high responses to the ketogenic diet. Have you looked into the research a little bit? Dysbetalipoproteinemia, people have E2 too, and they're fine, except if they have another reason to increase the production of their LDL. So these people, the E2 isoform, it doesn't attach as well as readily to the LDL receptor, whereas like E4 actually has more of affinity to it, which they believe actually decreases the LDL receptors on the surface, and then E3 has a normal affinity. Interesting stuff, but it doesn't, as far as I can tell, it has no correlation to those who are hyper responders. And
I think it has like a very small correlation, but it's absolutely not.
It's not the trigger.
Strong. No, not at all. I definitely feel like, and I feel a lot of my experiments have demonstrated how much this associates back to energy metabolism, and particularly being fat-based energy metabolism. You probably already heard about my white bread and processed meat experiment that I did recently.
Interesting stuff. I'm not going to lie, it's interesting.
Insane, and I'm never going to do it again, but prove the point. And there's a lot of people who say, oh, well, it's, meat versus, Whole Foods or something like that. Whole Foods, plant-based. I'm like, no, I think it's energy. I think is the substrate ultimately going to be glucose, or is it going to be fatty acids? And this has the downstream result ultimately towards the lipoproteins. So anyway, we'll step off of that for a sec. Let's go into the next question. For hyper responders, Limiting saturated fat and replacing with other healthy fats, macadamia nuts, for example, will lower LDL-P. Why does this happen, and is this change beneficial? This comes from David Mann.
Yeah, this is what I do with every patient that this occurs in. If they're doing bulletproof coffee, I simply just have them remove the butter, and if they need some sort of fat, they go with a macadamia nut oil or avocado oil. Olive oil doesn't taste that great in coffee, so try to stay away from that, and also get rid of the coconut oil as well. That won't have as much of an effect as the butter. The reason this happens, this is in residency, I got really into this, is the LDL receptor activity differences between those who ingest saturated fats versus monounsaturated versus polyunsaturated. Polyunsaturated seems to actually upregulate LDL receptor activity. Monounsaturated is kind of in the middle, and then saturated fat seems to downregulate the LDL receptor activity. That's the best explanation, the best mechanism that I can see. Why this happens. Someone was asking in your group about what would be the reason from an evolutionary standpoint. I'm like, that's actually a great question. I mean, we could get into the oxidation and all that different stuff, but I do think the change is beneficial. Of course, unless you're drinking corn oil, I would not, would not drink corn oil just to get your LDL particles down. I do think that there are other things in nuts like almonds, some of the soluble fibers that may be able to bind some of the bile cholesterol in your intestine. I don't know if you've talked about this, but the endogenous versus exogenous pathway. Endogenous is all the the lipoproteins, cholesterol you're making, but exogenous through the intestine, so what we eat, but also the biggest component of that exogenous, it's not the dietary cholesterol, it's more of the bile acid with the cholesterol there. So potentially if you're having like nuts, specifically whole almonds, some of the soluble fiber along with the monounsaturated fat may actually reduce the LDL particles, and I do think it's beneficial. But
actually, let me go into the next question, because this is from our pal Tucker Goodrich. I'm sure you've seen his tweets in and around. What explains the rapid rise of cardiovascular disease in the industrialized and then developing nations during the 20th century? And why do undeveloped people still not have cardiovascular disease?
Yeah,
that's a good question.
Awesome question. Multifactorial, but I think a lot of it comes down to abdominal obesity, sedentary lifestyle, smoking, insulin resistance. I mean, that's what we see. I mean, yeah, sure, maybe high, people, they'll always talk about the high fat diets causing increased LDL cholesterol levels, but I think if I had to guess, I would be guessing abdominal obesity and insulin resistance, and maybe combined with the increase in LDL particles. So I think a lot of these underdeveloped places, they're eating a whole foods based diet. They're not sedentary, and they don't have insulin resistance. That's what I think.
It is an interesting question, because I do think that the more that I was looking into, and I'm not really into like the diet anthropology stuff.
Yeah.
I do find that pretty much you've got this massive variety of diets in indigenous populations. I mean, really runs the gambit, and you don't even need to take them out of their, homestead. You just add our diet. You just put a McDonald's on their corner, and very rapidly things go downhill.
It's
right?
Sad.
It is, because I love my country, but I can't help it. I feel like we've exported a lot of bad dietary habits around the world. I just
lots of money flowing around here. But yeah, that's I'm big into exercise, staying lean, eating mostly whole foods. That's I'm with you on that.
So sure enough, we've got one that kind of cuts more to the heart. This is from Jim Swahilin. I hope I pronounced that right. What is the importance of very high LDL-P particle count in light of having optimal pattern A with regard to cardiovascular diseases?
Yeah, so I'm, again, I think LDL particle levels are independent risk factor for atherosclerosis, despite even having a pattern A with like larger LDL particles. When you look at like what can actually get into the endothelium, you know, you can see chylomicron remnants even getting into the endothelium, and those are huge, humongous compared to even the largest LDL particles. So I think it's an independent risk factor regardless of your particle size. Now, the interest. So when I go into that analogy of the cargo ships and the cargo, you know, depending on what's contained on that cargo ship, maybe they're more readily retained. You know, people talk about the small LDL particles being more readily oxidized. Maybe not though. Like there's even larger LDL particles may have they may aggregate more once they're in there, and then they're harder to get out. I don't know. It's interesting stuff, but
but it does bring forward the point that we don't really have a lot of data that isolates pattern A, particularly in the context of a low carb diet, particularly where we have, you know, certifiably low triglycerides, high HDL, along with high LDL particle count. That's certainly something I'm very interested in, as you well know. Yeah. I'm trying to get a hold of larger data sets that can help, you know, confirm or shoot this down.
I think, exactly. I think we're going to need even further from that, or more to that. Yeah, I think that would be good preliminary data. But I still think there are going to be enough genetics involved there. You know, I don't know. We don't have to get all into the intricacies, but I still want to tease out those with genetically, you know, FH causes versus just strictly the diet induced. Because I feel like we have enough data to say, well, these genetic induced increases, yeah, they're at risk, but I want to see more of the diet induced. But anyway,
totally agree, completely agree. Look, if you would expect that the symptoms we would observe in the lean mass hyperresponder group would be comparable to those who have familiar hypercholesterolemia if the only thing that mattered was high LDL particle count, right? So I myself, I'm very interested. It's why I keep asking, not just on the positive ends with what people see, but also on the negative ends. You know, I want to know if there's higher, you know, amounts of, say, xanthomas, or if there are other things that tend to be commonplace with those who have FH, and especially at the levels that they do.
So one of the interesting things, because you were asking about the xanthomas and other cholesterol deposited type of physical manifestations. So I was looking more into it. Are there secondary causes of increases of LDL levels that cause xanthomas? And I didn't find any citations or case studies. All it said was, in the multiple places I looked, yes, this can happen with secondary causes, but I didn't see any case studies. So I'm very interested in your group to see if, you know, after however many years, people start developing it. Because it should start, with some of those levels that I see in the group, I've never seen that unless they have homozygous, which is super,
right?
Which is homozygous, not heterozygous, but homozygous, and that's extremely rare. But I've never seen levels like that. So they technically, if they're like that for 5 years or 10, they should start developing these things. So
a lot, it really much more should have developed sooner. So of those people that are in the group, I want to say it's maybe 1 year to 2 years or something along those lines. I have had plenty of people who have been in the low carb movement before it was even big,
right?
Who have had FH-like levels and were already of the mindset of, I don't care about doctors or anything else, you know, and I'll just share this data with you. And in many of those cases, I had to beg them to bring me their data because they already weren't like going and getting regular testing and so forth. And I've asked them this question, you know, several times over. There's one person in particular has like one of the highest ranges that I've seen, and that person doesn't want me to talk about them publicly too much, but like the total cholesterol was, I want to say 723 or something like that, and LDL of 585, and had been that way for a fairly long period of time. and this person is in the medical profession, had gotten enormous numbers of different cardiometabolic and other tests to actually check CIMT, so forth, clean bill of health across the board.
Amazing.
And again, these are anecdotal. Believe me, I feel like almost every time I say any of these things, I don't want to come off as the guy who's now just entirely categorically dismissive. I'm just stating what it is that I've seen up to this point, because believe me, if I was anecdotally seeing the opposite, I would be very upfront about that. And that's why I feel like it's important to acknowledge what is yet an unanswered question. But at the same time, see where we're going.
How these questions start. I mean, yeah, we have this LDL hypothesis. At least we can see in whatever these cases are, the LDL hypothesis seems to fit. But in these very metabolically healthy, ketogenic diet-induced increases in LDL. I mean, I personally wouldn't bet on it, or bet myself on it. But like, I don't know. There could be some other special things going on that I just we can talk about immune function and endothelial differences. I don't know, and I wouldn't bet myself on it, but people have autonomy, so.
And that's what a lot of people do. For what it's worth, a lot of people that come to the group, a lot of people that come to the website, they say, look, I just want advice on how to lower cholesterol, and we provide that as well. Everybody is on their own life journey, and the one thing that I think is potentially concerning to me, and I'll bet you would probably agree, is anybody who doesn't feel good, either because their diet doesn't make them feel good, or because they're just uncomfortable with the numbers that they're seeing given what they know, and feel to belong to the tribe that they're in, they should ignore that. I vehemently disagree with that. I think everybody should be aware that they're on their own health journey, and they need to find their own comfort levels.
Yeah.
So let me go to the next question. This is actually a good one. This is from our friend Keto Paul McLean, all the way from Oz. Here's a cholesterol science question. How important / significant is RBC, as in red blood count, cholesterol pool to our health? And how is it impacted by changes in the lipoprotein cholesterol pool?
Yes, this is a more of a Dr. Dayspring question. I am not as well versed or well read on the RBC pool of cholesterol as opposed to lipoproteins. I think it's actually really interesting. He linked a little review here on the red blood cells play a role in reverse cholesterol transport, considering that if our destruction of red blood cells and all these different things, and how they can go out eventually into our.
I think it's relatively new, at least to me. I don't really know that there was a lot of focus on this, at least in the literature that I've seen before recently, like quite literally within like the last several years, which is really young in terms of medicine. That's fine. We can.
Fascinating stuff. I don't know enough about it to really comment, but I think it's really interesting.
It is. So I'm going to go on to the next question. We're now going to the blog questions. Unfortunately, I probably should have been more specific that I'd like people to ask 1 or 2 per some of the ones that I sent you. Some people asked like 20 in the same comment. Yeah, so I've kind of selected out a few. This is from Michael Sparber. Wow, where do people, they're hitting me with these names that I know I'm having trouble pronouncing, but if Dave's energy model is correct and VLDLs deliver triglycerides to muscle cells for energy, then what exactly is the role of cholesterol? And I think to kind of expand on that, what he's basically referring to is what do you think is the role of cholesterol on board lipoproteins? Like you mentioned a little bit earlier, and I think a lot of people in the pro-lipid lowering camp would say there's no purpose for serum cholesterol to be found in the blood on board lipoproteins. It's almost like a mistake of evolution of some kind.
Yeah, I think so. With your energy model hypothesis, which I think is super fascinating, obviously, if these things are floating all around, they're cleaving off the triglycerides, and all that's left is basically a bunch of leftover LDL particles with cholesterol on them, and you don't really need them anymore. And I think they're just there, almost like garbage in a way, and they're just waiting to be recycled by the liver. That's what I think. I don't think they're playing a role. The cholesterol is playing any other role. Could be wrong, but from what I know, I would say that they're just hanging out, waiting to be recycled.
Are you familiar with my resistance training experiment recently?
No, I don't know about your resistance training experiment.
So first of all, painfully, I have to mention, you may not realize that since my research began, I've had to keep from doing any resistance training because I've anticipated that it would impact my lipid numbers.
Probably.
I did not mean to do that for years. At the time, each time I was doing an experiment, I would go, okay, now I can finally get around to resistance training and then test that in isolation. Unfortunately, because I kept getting new things, it eventually got to a point where I was like, screw it, finally going to do this. In order to do it for 20 days, I ate exactly the same food, exactly the same way, even at the same times. And I did the same way, same exact, everything the same, so that my cholesterol levels could be fairly steady. Yeah. And I hypothesized actually on the podcast with Peter Attia, if you listen to that one.
Okay, I haven't listened to that.
It's a long one. It's like 3.5 hours. I wouldn't blame you if you don't. But I hypothesized then that if I were to do this experiment, and I was looking forward to doing it, that my LDL cholesterol and LDL particle count would go down in the intervention phase of resistance training. And I hypothesized the reason for this is because I believe that there's more peripheral tissue endocytosis, especially for muscle repair and growth. That it's actually specifically receptor-mediated endocytosis in order to use the phospholipids and free cholesterol and cholesterol esters on board for additional help on the part of the cells that need it. That's the advantage of having Home Depot driving by your house a lot when you can't leave it, right?
So the cholesterol would go down, but the particle numbers would stay, or the particles would.
No, I believe the particle numbers would go down too. There's a before this resistance training experiment ever took place, I did do distance running.
Okay.
Through 5.5 months in the middle of my research. And as I kind of hypothesized then, during the periods of time where I was the sorest, where like I had a cold open to my training, that had a huge gap in my inversion pattern. In other words, my LDL-C and my LDL-P were much lower than what I would have pegged them to be, given having mapped out my metabolism to the degree that I had. That was at the beginning, and that was also at the end. The largest gap happened to be at the end after I'd done a 5K one day, a 10K another day, and then finally a full marathon on the last day. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I think that your one very prominent reason for lipoproteins is for repair. And that's why the body's being very proactive about making sure there's a certain pool of low-density lipoproteins available, and why cells have LDL receptors in particular, specifically for that endocytosis. But again, theoretical setting. But that's why I mentioned in the case of it being potentially a waste product, I sort of push back on that, because if it truly was a waste product, there should be no benefit. Like if you can really get rid of all the LDL particles in your body, there should be no benefit on mortality, no benefit on disease fighting or anything, right? It should just be it should be an only good thing to get rid of it.
Correct. Right.
So let's go ahead and. Oh, good. You were going to say.
Good. Yeah, good stuff. Next. Yeah,
so this was the comment that had a lot of stuff. I'm just going to pick one question out of it. What does he think about the study that showed all-cause mortality in women is inversely correlated with reduction in total cholesterol, which you kind of addressed a little bit earlier?
Yeah, I'd have to know which study. A lot of these epidemiological studies, we see kind of a reverse causation. These people aren't healthy, and all things start going, production of everything starts going down, including lipoproteins, cholesterol. And so that would explain that. That's why we look at these genetic models and go, well, gosh, is having low cholesterol really going to kill us? Or is there something else going on that was lowering the cholesterol? And that's my understanding of the data. But again, And you know, that's what we see with these PCSK9 trials. Those are going to get, you know, keep going longer. We're going to see more data in the statin trials. We don't see that there. It tends to be these epidemiological studies that show this.
I'm honestly, like, I try to avoid talking about the drugs because I feel like it's a whole other front, if you will.
Yeah, I don't disagree.
But the PCSK9 inhibitors, I feel like some of the most damaging information to the lipid hypothesis came out of those. So one of them is you really do get people to levels of like 20 or 30 milligrams per deciliter. I mean, super crazy low levels of LDL. You would think they would become like practically immune to cardiovascular disease. Like it just could not possibly happen. And I think the counterpoint that would be made to that is, well, wait a sec, we're only looking at, you know, a 2.5 year, you know, time horizon or something along those lines. But the reverse then goes to the other direction, which is, okay, but you're also assessing and extrapolating off of likewise trials of that amount and then going by the relative risk ratio of that. Well, regardless, if you brought it down to that level, there shouldn't be theoretically much more progressing atherosclerosis under those conditions. I mean, I would have thought that
that's why people, I mean, that's why the whole residual risk thing, it's like, well, gosh. And you know, again, if it's just LDL particles, then yeah, I don't disagree. But you know, we look at inflammation, we look at all these other things that could be going on. I think if you were to hit these people earlier on in life and they'd have a decreased burden with the PCS, despite having, you know, maybe not as much risk when they're younger, that's where we'd really see it. But yeah, lifetime burden, other risk factors, that's what I believe, you know, causes that. But yeah, the interesting stuff like no cognitive changes when they bring them down to that level, those low levels, and no other, as far as we can tell, no other issues that I've seen from the data anyway.
Well, without question, I mean, the thing that you brought up earlier that I definitely want to agree with is, as with the potential reverse causality, let's get just more quality data. Like for one, I really feel like all-cause mortality should be the first thing in the abstract or the results, right? Like it should start there, and that should be like one of the first things to look for. But moreover, when talking about, say, modality, right? Like when talking about events, I think it is a very valid point that yourself, many others have brought up. Hey, wait a sec. Let's say that you're not even talking about cardiovascular disease death. What if instead you're talking about, you know, surviving a heart attack or surviving a stroke, but now your quality of life is significantly dampened, right? There does seem to be a lot more prominent and stronger evidence that events are reduced in bringing down LDL, right? But you'd then have a skeptic jump in from the other side. Certainly, I would be myself asking this question, okay, if we're really going to look at quality of life, then we should look across all metrics. Because if it is true that somebody who's, you know, lowering LDL a lot, and it turns out it actually has a net negative effect on cancer, means that, you know, some number of people are actually going to get cancer and then actually go through chemotherapy, still survive and so forth, but their quality of life has gone down by a great deal. We should figure out how it is that we can get a broader base of this data so that we have a high quality number of metrics, not just a few specific ones.
Yeah, no, very important stuff, of course. Yeah.
Let's go one more question. This is from Todd R. Allen. What is, quote, best practice in evaluating desirability of statin therapy and weighing likely benefit?
I think you already asked me that question.
Oh yeah, I did. You know what? I'm sorry.
You started with that one and then you went up to the other questions.
That one kind of repeated. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
You know what? Would you mind if we took just, how are you doing on time? Do we need to let you go yet?
Yeah, I'm going to go work out here in a second, but what's up? Tell me what's up.
Okay, I was going to say, we could do just one or two questions from the chat if you want.
Is anybody, yeah, do you have any questions?
We'll do just two questions real quick. I'm actually, I'm pinging Siobhan right now because she actually has some set up for us.
Okay.
So it looks as if she has one from Michael I knew I'd have to say this name again. Schwarber. Or could it be that there is a rise in LDLs without a rise in cholesterol? And he follows up, how do they even measure cholesterol if it doesn't float in blood? Water insoluble, I assume, or water insoluble.
Yeah, this is where you start getting into the lab assays. Dr. Dayspring, he did such a great job at kind of explaining, and he actually sent me when I went and met him back in 2012, he sent me the huge handbook of the history of how they actually did the labs. And it was like, I don't know, you go through training and it's like you kind of send people's blood off and it comes back with these numbers.
Right.
And we don't think about it, but it's like, no, we should actually understand like how they do these, because, so for instance, like testosterone, the assays, like they're trying to standardize that because you get a lot of variance. So for cholesterol and these types of things, and Dr. Dayspring could do a way better job. I'm just a Padawan when it comes to understanding these things. But yeah, they depending on the cholesterol or the triglyceride, they have different ways of measuring that. But
well, and I feel like the assays thing, like you could spend months learning about these assays and their process. It is not, this is why I like high frequency testing, by the way. The reason I have as much faith as I do in NMRs, it's because I have 105 of them. I've drawn my blood a lot against very controlled circumstances so that I could confirm that the numbers were fairly consistent. So from that perspective, I can say, well, even if it's off in a consistent margin way.
Yeah.
That I can feel more confident about. That's good. Right. Okay, so we have just one more question. This is actually a great one because this has, of course, gotten a lot more talk lately. What does Spencer think about CAC scores?
I love them. I know. Is it Ivor? Is that how you say his name?
Yeah.
So he and I have gotten into it on Twitter, and but I actually and Dr. Low carb guy from Denver, my friend.
Oh, Jeffrey Gerber.
Gerber. Why did I just blank? I see them talking about it a lot. Actually, their CAC scores are great. It's a great way to where it's like somebody's like right around this level of LDL particles. Everything else is normal or at perfect risk factors, and you're going, should I put you on a statin? Should I not? And if there's zero, it's like, well, this is a pretty good indication that we shouldn't. I will say it's probably not. It's not accurate in kind of those younger crowd that have like FH. Some of these plaques, soft capped atherosclerosis that won't be picked up on calcium score, but it's a great. I use them a lot with my patients, especially because a lot of them follow you guys and a lot of them follow my stuff, and it's like, let's just get it. We talk about your risk. It gives us a great way to stratify. I don't want to rely on them too much. I've had not my patients, but the patient's brother or sister were like recently, like, I don't trust that. My brother just had a 0 on it, and two weeks later just died. And I was like, but they were young. They had clear FH, and it's a lifelong burden when they're all the way to 40 years old. They're not going to have a lot of calcium there. But I did tag you in that Twitter that just the other day that they started looking at it in FH. It seems to be a pretty good predictor there. But I love CAC scoring along with CRP levels and all the different risk stratifiers.
I myself really like it a lot. I probably promote it as much as Ivor does.
Yeah.
But I think, by the way, if somebody is watching this, they go on a low carb diet, they see their cholesterol rise, and they're of the mind that they would like to do more of a wait and see. I certainly feel even stronger in that case. They should consider getting a CAC so they can bookend. One of the worst situations that happens to us is when somebody has been low carb, has had high LDL, but they get their very first CAC score 4 years into the diet.
Right.
The problem is it could absolutely be true that the low carb diets induced higher levels of LDL was in fact the reason for the higher level of calcification. The problem is we really don't know, right? And if there really is, per what you were referring to earlier, something like a kind of inertia of bad health that has to kind of catch up and get resolved, you don't get to know that very easily as well. So as with CAC, I think it matters less what the number is as it does the progression. So if you have a positive CAC score, I think you want to know, and I think you want to then know about how fast it's progressing, and at least then you can manage it better.
Yep, I'm with you, man. Yeah, no, great question. So, appreciate you having me on. And the blog is going to go way into detail. I'm getting into like, well, can we even compare low carb increases to FH and why or why not? Blah blah blah. I mean, it's long. It's going to be long and in-depth.
Love it. Can't wait. As I told you before, if the most damning article, or at least the strongest counter case to people being comforted about having high LDL on a low carb diet were to exist, I would love it to be on cholesterolcode.com.
Yeah, no, you're the right platform to do it. I really appreciate you allowing me to do it because, again, I'm not like, I'm not going to go on Twitter like, you guys are a bunch of idiots. We've had our spats back and forth, but all in good fun, and I think it's great to have this discussion because I'm personally, I think it's so fascinating. It's really cool because, like, so what if your LDL goes up but everything else goes down? Do we have to be worried? These are good questions. I think they're amazing questions.
It's without question, to me, it's something that needs to get answered as soon as possible.
Yeah,
it's a moment. We're in a moment of uncertainty, and that's not the worst thing in the world. But it is something that I feel like we should come together on. I feel like people who are pro lipid lowering, who are not pro lipid lowering, I mean, everybody should go, hey, let's find out. Let's get good data.
I would love it. I would love to show a decreased risk despite the increases in LDL, because that means that we have a very powerful tool in a low carbohydrate diet that goes against conventional wisdom, that has other special properties about it. I think that would be great to know as a clinician.
I agree. Totally agree. Well, how do people reach you? How do they know where to find you?
Twitter is at Dr. Nadolsky, Nadolsky, but I don't use Twitter as much as I do my Instagram. I'm very snarky on Instagram, a lot of funny memes. I make fun of everybody. I make fun of carnivores. I make fun of vegans. I make fun of keto. I make fun of if it fits your I make fun of everybody. So don't.
You make fun of people who are comfortable with their high LDL as well. It's all good. Where the point is, can we rib and have fun and then still sit down and have a discussion like this? And I think we've shown this, right?
So Instagram at Dr. Nadolsky, Facebook Dr. Spencer Nadolsky. Yes, thanks for having me on.
Absolutely, and I thank you for being our first guest. Sorry about the initial technical issues, but I'm really glad you got to join us.
Very good, man. Have a good one.
You too. We'll catch you later.
Bye.